Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming along tonight to our most recent SAMAG panel, which is called Be Careful What You Wish For, The Pleasures, Perils and Pitfalls of Success. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm going to hand over to Matt Ravier, who's going to lead this discussion. We're really excited about all the speakers that we've brought together today, who all come from very different programming backgrounds. And so if you could just give a really... Actually, before I say that, we're going to have questions at the end. We'll have about 20 minutes of questions at the end. And I'm going to be running around with the microphone, so if you could just hold on to your questions until then, and I'll run over to you. But yeah, a warm round of applause for our speakers here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lex. Thank you all for being here tonight. How's everyone doing tonight? Good, good, excellent. Is this anyone's first time at SAMAG? Oh, a few of you. That's fantastic. Welcome. And for the others, welcome back. Isn't SAMAG amazing? I came to discover it quite late. I was asked to speak on a panel, and I was like, how has this been going? Apparently for several decades. And I didn't even know about it. And now I compulsively, when I can't make it, watch the or the videos online. And I encourage you to do so. There's now a treasure trove of interesting conversations online that you can catch up on, which is really fantastic. I'm really excited to chat with these guys. It's a great lineup. As we all know, it can be difficult to make ends meet as a festival, as an arts organization, or as an artist. And yet, we have, I think, some of the best festivals, some of the best arts organizations, some of the best events in the world, right here in Sydney or in Australia. So how do we make it work? How is it that we're able to kick these goals and get the success that we strive for? So for this discussion, Lex has brought together some of the country's, I think, best festival directors, producers, and curators. And they've seen their organizations reach kind of a level of success that's as thrilling and as exciting as it is terrifying. So they will be sharing their thoughts with us tonight. It's four very different perspectives from brilliant minds, I think, working on a very different scale. From a small, kind of but thriving boutique arts and music festival in a farm outside of Sydney, to the iconic, world-renowned cultural colossus that is the Sydney Opera House. So what do they have in common? I suspect it's a passion for the arts, a determination to perhaps define success on their own terms. But let's find out, because as our special guest tonight, we have Lisa Dempster, who is the artistic director / CEO of Melbourne Writers Festival. Thanks for coming to Sydney to talk with us. We've got Claire Downs, who's the festival founder and director of Secret Garden Festival. We have Miles Merrill, who is the creative director and performing writer at Word Travels. And we've got Danielle Harvey from the Sydney Opera House, who's the acting head of programming, and I think also the programmer of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas and All About Women. For those who don't know me, my name is Matt Ravier. I have, for the past decade, run a small nonprofit company called The Festivalists, doing a kind of interactive arts events and film festivals around town. I've had some modest successes and some colossal failures. I've tried to learn from them as much as I could. But I think what running a small arts organization has brought me is a huge amount of curiosity for people who are doing it really well. And we've got 4 of those tonight. So we're going to hear from them now. So I don't know if we mentioned it, but there's a hashtag, which I believe is SAMAG 2016. Is that right? Or just SAMAG, sorry, just SAMAG. Feel free to tweet and do your thing with that. Please join the conversation. If you've got a burning question, don't hesitate to interrupt us, but we will have kind of a 20-minute questions at the end. But let's get to know our panelists. I think we're going to chat a little bit about how we define and how we measure success. And so the best place to start, I think, is what you guys are passionate about, what you're working on, what you do, that drives you every day. And so maybe, Lisa, you could start.
Sure. So what I'm passionate about is quite broad, but to give you some background, I'm the director of the Melbourne Writers Festival, which is a 10-day festival for everyone who reads that happens across the last 2 weeks of August in Melbourne every year. This year we have about 400 events taking place with about 400 artists in about 25 venues across Melbourne, outer metro Melbourne and regional Victoria. And within the festival, we also do a 4-day schools program, which is about 80 events for young people of school age. It's a big, diverse, vibrant and fun festival. I often talk about the festival not just being about talks and lectures, but more of an arts festival that has a literature engine, which brings me back to my main passion. It's reading and writing, good reading and writing and discussion of ideas. Before I was at the Melbourne Writers Festival, I was lucky enough to do an AsiaLink residency and spent a season on the programming team at the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival in Bali. And before that, I was the director of the Emerging Writers Festival for 3 years and founder of a little festival called the Digital Writers Festival. So I've sort of been passionately engaged with people who are creative, people who are writing, and people who are putting ideas out in the world for 7 years now.
Great. Yeah. Claire?
In a nutshell.
That's impressive. My name's Claire. I run a music festival called Secret Garden, which is 5,000 for 5,000 people on my parents' farm, an hour southwest of Sydney. It's been running for 8 years and it sells out every year without announcing a lineup, which is a really wonderful thing. And other projects I'm working on, well, I run a little satellite event called Cubby House, which is on a Sunday, and it's all the great things that could happen on a Sunday in one event. And my background has been working on a whole bunch of festivals, both in Australia and abroad. And I'm passionate about having fun and creating fun, and you know, and creating community. When I was little, my parents used to take me to sport games because I'd just go crazy over a crowd. I just love them, and so I like creating communities.
Yep, my name is Miles, and I'm the director of Word Travels. We're a literary and literacy arts not-for-profit, and we run 4 major programs each year: the Multilingual Poetry Slam, the Rumble Young Performing Writers Program, the Australian Poetry Slam, which is a big national or kind of international program with about 60 events across Australia, and then moves into Beijing, Chengdu, Suzhou, Shanghai, across China, a bit in Indonesia and New Zealand. And then we cap off the program every year in mid-October with a 3-day story festival. So I'm passionate about combining stories and storytelling with live experiences. We are getting more into digital media as an organization, but I believe that the human-to-human experience is the most valuable one we have.
Danielle?
So I'm Danielle from the Sydney Opera House, and I'm passionate about making experiences happen for people both live and digitally. That's and my current role is acting head of programming, which means I just pretend to know about more things than I really do, as some of my colleagues in the audience will attest to for sure. And when I'm not doing that, I'm the head of international development for the Sydney Opera House, which doesn't mean anything that you think it means. I co-curate the Festival of Dangerous Ideas and All About Women. I get to sometimes stretch my commercial legs and do some sort of big crazy spectacle type things like big magic shows and stuff like that. And I am very much about how digital can share live experiences and enhance live viewers' experiences. So that's what I'm really keen on talking about a bit tonight. And yeah, and before that I was at Mardi Gras as a festival executive producer, which is where my kind of spectacle came from. But also when I was there, I started the Queer Thinking Talks and Ideas section of it, because I really felt like we had to find a way of coming back to talking about what Mardi Gras, you know, existed for. So, yeah, that's me.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Obviously, success takes many forms, and in the arts, the size of the audience, the engagement of the audience, are just some of the ways that we measure success. So perhaps let's start there with the audience. I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about an example of a recent kind of smash hit, whether it's your last festival or a particular event within that, and how it came about, and perhaps if any aspect of it took you by surprise, or if the success of it had any kind of unsuspected effect on your organization. Maybe we'll work back from Danielle.
Well, I think talking about the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, which it'll be the 8th festival this year coming in September, beginning of September. And I've worked on that festival for 6 years, and it has been growing and growing each year. And I think what's kind of interesting with that is when you have something really successful like that, and it's what a great title, like it's, you know, it's got all of those sorts of things. You sort of think, oh, well, you know, we could do this or we could do that, and, you know, we could take it here, or we could do this. And really recognising that success is finding a home within Sydney, that it's on, I think, the cultural calendar now, and sharing that more broadly. So actually, one of the successes from the last festival with All About Women earlier this year was our satellite program, where we took where we live streamed and created live events in regional parts of Australia and New Zealand. And the numbers for that, you know, all up across 22, 21 little live sites was 1,000 people, which in Opera House land, that's like very small, because success for us is, you know, Festival of Dangerous Ideas, 26,000 attendances, things like that. But that was hugely successful, because when you think about how many people are coming in those regional areas, so that was, and everyone really kind of felt that it was, you know, sharing something that's great that happens in Sydney and taking it a bit further. And
was it easy to convince everyone around you that that had been a successful program, even though it reached numbers that perhaps were not Opera House style numbers?
It's all about how you say it, right? No, I think people. I think that I think there's a real maturity. I'm very lucky to have people who kind of get it, that, you know, success can't just be about GBO and how many tickets are sold. Like, if you keep
GBO being
gross box office, so how much money you make and how many tickets you sold. If you keep measuring things that way, then you're not going to have a very diverse cultural offering. So obviously that is an important thing, but I think that they recognise that this was coming, you know, the reason that we wanted to do this was for very, very different reasons, and that there's huge opportunity there. But of course, I am sitting in a really large arts organisation with a fair amount of, you know, security in what we do. But it does mean that when you try and do something different, one of the biggest challenges there in a big organisation is, and, you know, we were talking earlier, like especially with some of the smaller events, the agility that you have to just make it happen when it's just by yourself is really not there. You have to onboard everybody, and you have to, you know, and that's 700 people at the Opera House to sort of say, oh, yes, 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 yes. So, but it does mean that when you do that, and you've got it, and you've got something great and something amazing, you know, like you're all systems firing. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Miles, do you want to tell us a little bit about a recent success of yours?
Well, it's so varied what you can call success. So, you know, we sell out the Drama Theatre with our National Poetry Slam final, but that's about 550 people. And so that we can call that success. But then we run the Rumble Young Performing Writers program, and we work with a student at Arthur Phillip High School named Mohammed Jallo. And when he starts working with us, he's writing poems on his phone that say, I'm gonna be a millionaire entrepreneur by the age of 23, ain't nobody gonna stop me. And that's in February. And by the time we have him through workshops and mentoring performing at Sydney Writers Festival in May, he gets up and performs at the Riverside Theatre a poem that goes, this is for my mother. The way you carried me on your shoulders through the refugee camp while you starved, feeding me teaspoons of food. I can't count the number of times I've seen you kneel to pray, taking your headscarf off to wipe the tears away. And so for me, that was like you know, a transformative experience for another human being that was more valuable than going, oh, we're able to put on a show that sold this many tickets. And if we can continue to work with him and other students and see that kind of transformation where they believe in their own experience and they use that experience to tell their story, and, you know, there's a big crowd at the Riverside or the Opera House that hears that, that's, to me, the valuable thing, is the experience of that, of the, I guess, the people that we work with being able to have access to those audiences that are the sold-out show.
I guess the idea of slams are quite widespread, obviously, in the US, where you're from. Yeah. Was it, you were quite instrumental, I believe, in introducing that to Australia. Did you expect the sort of success that they would find here? Well,
it wasn't. I started doing slams in '96, so I couldn't really call 2016 a quick succession. But essentially, I came here, was performing in pubs with a couple of guys, and we were performing pretty much to the same people every Monday night. And one of the other guys was from Chicago, and he was like, the audience is going to get tired of hearing the same 4 poets every Monday. Why don't we do an open mic? I was like, you're from Chicago, why don't we do a poetry slam? Because open mic can be a little bit boring as well, but you're kind of empowering the audience, giving them an opportunity to hold up a scorecard and, you know, tell you what they think. And so we kind of did that for a while, and it didn't really take off until 2004 when I had an opportunity to work for a thing called the Australian Poetry Festival, which no longer exists. They asked me to come and MC their performance poetry competition. And at the first meeting, they said, what we're going to do is invite 50 poets to perform for 5 minutes each, and we'll find 3 professional judges to judge the competition. And I was like, who's the audience for that? And they said, well, we want 50 poets because then they'll bring their friends and their family. And I was like, yeah, but poor 50th poet. Like, you know, like the 49 other friends and family who just left. I was like, why don't you, first of all, shorten it to 2 minutes, and then contact all the poetry nights around Sydney, from Newcastle to Wollongong to the Blue Mountains and all around Sydney, and say, will you run a heat? And, you know, instead of doing your monthly event, just on, you know, Tuesday night, just make it a heat and choose your audience. Will choose 2 people to go through to this poetry slam. And so, yeah, it was kind of a successful thing where suddenly they had 10 events leading up to a key event in their festival, and it kind of sold out, and it was the biggest thing that they'd ever done, and we limited it to like 20 people at this final. And then Sydney Festival asked us to do a show. State Library said, can you run a poetry slam for us? So we did Sydney Poetry Slam. Then I said, there's a library in every small town in Australia. We could do New South Wales. And then we pitched it to every state library, and then it became a national thing. But then in 2010, the State Library of New South Wales was like, hey, we've looked at the budget, and for the price of 1 poetry slam, we've realized that we could do 5 poetry book launches a year. And I was like, well, geez, what are we going to do about the slam then? And I said, well, it's just done. We're not doing it anymore. And I said, but every other state has already purchased the marketing collateral, the posters, the website, everything's built. Yep, we're going to cut our losses, and we're just going to tell everybody that it's gone. And I was like, all right, well, do you mind if I continue to run it? Which basically was like the beginning of my martyrdom, really, because because, you know, the State Library has an events team, marketing team, publicity team, education team. It was like me, a friend, and someone who said, I'll be your chairperson if you want to set up a not-for-profit. And that was kind of, how I spent the first year of my giving up my life for poetry. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, now anyway, sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but it was just, you know, I mean, one of the advantages of suddenly setting up a small not-for-profit and getting a board was that we could apply for grants, whereas the State Library gets its state government funding, and we could go, all right, well, let's apply for a project grant for $60,000, and the day we got it, I was literally doing cartwheels with my one volunteer going, oh my God, this is amazing, we got $60,000. And I rang my chairperson and I was like, hey, we've got $60,000. And she's like, well, that's kind of half of the income of a middle manager in an average corporate annual job. How are you going to run a whole organization on $60,000? I was like, oh, yeah, true.
This is the agility, Danielle, that you envy, right?
Yeah.
That sounds good.
Yeah. So yeah, since then we've now got staff and general manager and regular annual program funding and all sorts of grants and sponsorship and stuff. But it's still every day. It's just like, are we going to make it this year? Sort of thing.
And Claire, you mentioned 5,000 people come to your parents' farm every year for Secret Garden, but when you started, it wasn't a huge festival, was it? Can you take us through a little bit about what makes Secret Garden so special? Because I don't know that everyone's been, but also how that happened.
Well, our first year was 300 people. It was a glorified 21st. Why it's grown to 5,000 people is Secret Garden's built on a bunch of different areas throughout a wilderness, and we hand over those areas to a bunch of different architects and artists and designers, and they're just given complete autonomy to do whatever they want in those areas. So over, like, say last year we had like a drag queen stage, or we had a human foosball table, which is, you know, foosball that you play in a pub. And we had a bunch of bamboo architects build a whole foosball table, and everybody strapped in and played human foosball, which is great. Yeah. So, and there are about 16 or so of these areas. So the reason why I mentioned earlier that Secret Garden sells out without announcing a lineup, and the reason for that is people are loyal to the event and the experiences that they know they'll get at the event. But yeah, recent success would have been 2 years ago we set up a kissing booth, and basically it was just a little hawker and a sign saying kissing booth, and then there was a menu on the side of what kiss you could order. So, you know, sloppy kiss with a side of pinch or whatever. And then we just left it there in the wilderness, and no poor like team member had to run this kissing booth for 30 hours. But yeah, we just left it there and let the punters run it, and they did. And for the entire festival, the kissing booth was full, and everybody got a kiss. Like nobody was, you know, too ugly, or no, you're the same sex as me and everybody got a kiss.
You got a cold sore.
Yeah, it was so great. And the reason why I see that as a success is, one, because we created a community that nurtured that kind of openness, and people felt safe and comfortable. And two, it said to me that our audience were giving us the permission to do whatever, and that's what we did the next year. You know, we just, you know, Secret Garden is mainly a participation type festival. You know, like you're not just a spectator at Secret Garden. So, you know, for last year, you know, we had applause areas where people could just sit in a seat and applause people as they walk through, and you know, it gave us permission to create sort of these organised fun, and that was a huge win for me as a person so passionate about community and people bonding.
Because you described it originally at the beginning of this conversation as a music festival, but without naming a particular musician, and indeed the audience doesn't know who's playing when they buy their tickets. So is this idea of the surprise and the element of surprise and interactivity what the Secret Garden kind of success is based on?
Yeah, I still, like on that, I still don't quite know how to describe Secret Garden. I say it's a music festival just so then people can kind of put us in a box and go, okay, yeah, that's what you are. But we're not exactly a music festival, I guess. But what the surprise element of the lineup allows us to do is to book the most daring music possible, and not be worried about box office, you know, our sales, and we don't get distracted by booking bands that sell a lot of tickets, but rather who is going to be perfect for that hour on that day of the festival, and who's going to be perfect, who's going to be the perfect act to follow up that act. And yeah, it just gives us a lot of freedom, which is which is such an honour and privilege.
So this is the agility of
Yep.
It's always been my dream to curate a festival like that. There's one in New Zealand as well, a music festival where you don't know who's playing until you show up. And I just think in the ideas and writing space, that would be the ultimate, really, just to invite people in and then surprise and delight.
Yeah, but that's what I find, like, that people are often loyal to the event, not who's playing. Like me, my experience as a punter, like I was, you know, as an 18-year-old going to Falls and Splendour and all of those, I never looked at the lineup. I was just obsessed with the events. And similar to, you know, I was at Sydney Writers Festival, I didn't mind. I mean, I just went along and bought tickets to whoever was playing. Speaking. But yeah, I'm always just loyal to the event and trust the programmers.
In the Mardi Gras, you know, heyday, the surprise and delight element was a big part of that party. For anybody who used to go to the big parties, you know, you didn't know who was playing, who the shows were. You bought your ticket. You know, it was an amazing thing that, you know, it was really, really cool. And I don't know what kind of changed there, but so the lineup started to become more important and things like that. But that was when you had the Kylie performances. You know, that's when those sorts of moments could happen, because also the pressure's not on the artist to commit to something that's sort of, you know, hyped up or whatever. You know, I think that kind of, you know, really helped.
More artistically free.
Yeah, and you know, that's certainly when I was there that I tried to put some of that back into those secret shows, and that's the only way we got George Michael or Cyndi Lauper, was to like not put them on the bill. I mean, worst kept secret in Sydney, right? But, you know, oh, they're doing a big arena show. Do you think, you know, somebody could make that phone call? Yes, I made the phone call. But if they thought that, you know, they had to sell tickets off it, it changes it for the artist.
Do you think it could happen in a literary environment? Like, can you imagine something like that in a talks and ideas kind of environment?
I think it's getting there. I think.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that we do with our Storyfest. In addition to having the National Slam, we always program this Saturday night as experiential. So an example I was talking about with you guys before was we took over a 1850s building in the rocks that had 6 beautiful refurbished rooms, and we basically sold tickets to the poetry and story Bordello, where people got to go in, and it sold out really quickly, so we added another night, but it could fit 120 people, but only 20 to a room. And so you got to have this experience of a poet or a storyteller or a musician coming in every 10 minutes, and you saw an hour's worth of programming, but they just rotated around to each room. And people just wanted to have that experience. And another time it was the literary love-in, where you come in and you have dinner and you're watching a band, and the band stops playing and the people sitting at your table are actually poets. And so they start sharing poetry with you while you're having dinner. So really looking for ways to, without talent and without names on the bill, going, well, how can we take these people on a journey? And I think, you know, that's been really effective, I think, for poetry, for us, because of the
I think we have that
immediacy of it.
in the Festival of Dangerous Ideas a lot. I mean, Lisa and I, we collaborate a lot because we've aligned our festivals to share talent. But for us, you know, certainly over the last couple of years, I'm sure most people don't know who, you know, Jesse Bering is, or, you know, Christopher Ryan, or people like that. Yeah, sure, they know some of the headliners, Salman Rushdie or Jermaine Greer, but they are buying into those other ones because they now trust the brand, they trust the festival, they trust our curation maybe, and people are hungry for, you know, ideas. So I think it could work. I mean, certainly that's what that festival, and that's what I think about a lot now in creating, when we're creating new sort of ideas-based, or, you know, any kind of art form, like, okay, yep, where's the headliner, but where's those ones to get people to just kind of take a chance, and certainly using the Opera House as a platform to, like, hopefully people will trust us a little bit and trust our curation and trust what we've done beforehand. And that's what's quite, I mean, with Lisa, she's been at Melbourne for a long time. I think you've built up quite a bit of trust in with your audience, and they're sort of taking chances, and you've been able to start to introduce the bloggers and things like that, which, you know.
And I think festivals sort of trade on being engines of discovery as well, and as the cultural landscape has changed over the last few decades, you know, certainly in Melbourne 30 years ago when the Melbourne Writers Festival started, we were the only literary programmers, and so we were the one place people had to come to see literature alive, and now the landscape is so much more crowded that festivals are sort of, defining themselves by the new, the different, the unusual, and really encouraging their audiences to come and discover those kinds of things. Although we all know, of course, the headliners are needed to get that box office and all those kinds of things, that you can actually come and discover a great new book or recommendation as well.
Because Lisa, amongst the speakers at your event, you've got obviously well-known writers, but you've got bloggers, you've got politicians, you've got raconteurs and storytellers.
My favourite kind, yes.
TV screenwriters as well, speechwriters.
Yeah.
So is that a curatorial strategy? Is it about reaching new audiences? And I'm asking this because we've talked about numbers. Obviously, you've all demonstrated through your events the ability to hit amazing kind of, at your own scales, big numbers. But how do you curate your audience? How do you reach new audiences that are untapped? And how important is that?
Very, for me. So I take quite a democratic approach to literature, and that's sort of definitely been my platform at the Melbourne Writers Festival. You say I've been there a long time. It's only been 3 years. It just feels like much longer, I think, for everyone involved.
I think that's quite long,
in a festival sense.
Well, because of when we started to work together, it was like we were immediately in there, talking about bloggers and a whole bunch of people that, it was out of the traditional literary world. So it felt like a big moment.
The first artist we ever shared, and the reason we started collaborating, I guess, was Tavi, who at the time was a 17-year-old blogger. We decided to bring her out to Australia. She went to Sydney Opera House and Melbourne Writers Festival, and obviously that was very big departure for the Melbourne Writers Festival. Someone so young, someone who's very much in that digital space, someone who's a prominent feminist. So there were sort of all these things coming together in that for me, which over the last 3 years I've continued to try and program in those kinds of spaces. The tagline of the festival is now for everyone who reads. And again, it's about that sort of sense of democracy, and there's all kinds of readers, people who watch film, cultural consumers, listen to podcasts and things like that. And I really think that they have a place in the audience at a writers' festival or an ideas festival or, a talks festival or whatever you want to call it. In terms of those new audiences, I think you need to balance the loyal and existing audience alongside the new audiences. Over the last 3 years at Melbourne Writers Festival, the audience has increased a lot, so by about 8,000, which is quite a lot for a festival that's been going for 30 years. But one of the things we've noticed is that the kinds of audiences who are coming along are kind of hard to define. So I think one of the new big audiences, our festival has gotten a lot younger, which is, about the Tavis and people like that, of course. But I think a lot more people are just sort of culturally curious about what happens at a writers' festival. And that was about getting artists in who aren't necessarily writers' festival people. So I think, clearly if you think of a writers' festival, you think of your Miles Franklin winners and your philosophers and people like that. But we've been programming John Ronsons and Tavis and bloggers and all sorts of different writers which appeal to a different kind of audience. And I think audiences for writers' festivals are now sort of seeing them as cultural events and places they can go and have fun and do different kinds of things at as well.
I'm interested in what we can learn from success. We talk a lot about learning from failures, but what we can learn from these successes, and also how easy it is to replicate them. Because sometimes it's the one thing that propels your organization to another level, whether it's a success that was years in the making, meticulously planned, or something that takes you a little bit by surprise. Often it's very tempting to replicate that. And I'm just wondering, perhaps, Claire, you might want to talk about that. Based on the success of Secret Garden, you've launched Cubby House in Sydney. Has it been easy, for example, to replicate the success of Secret Garden in a completely different environment?
Yeah, I think so. Just because, I'm the common factor in both those events, and so I was able to take my knowledge and my contacts from Secret Garden and put it into Cubby House. But in terms of, it wasn't replicating Secret Garden, it was quite different to what Secret Garden's like. Cubby House was a sit-down lunch. And we had a bunch of writers and poets and stuff you know, present. But yeah, I think what I've learned from success is just how to stay true to the core principles of why it all started. I think is, and why people originally loved it. So back when it was 300 people and booze was free, and I, to be honest, was pissed by 10 o'clock. You know,
10
AM, I hope.
you know what? Just staying true to those core values of Secret Garden, and making sure that no matter how big it ever gets, that we are still creating intimate experiences for people to talk to each other, and that the festival has a face, and that there are never any lines to bars, and that you don't have to pay for parking, and all those things that, you know, so could easily happen as we get bigger.
So does that mean you might put a cap on how many people attend?
Yeah,
or
right now there is a definite cap, which is 5,000. Don't want any more. Just because I don't know how, like, you know, as an audience, you're not going, yay, Secret Garden's twice the size this year. It's a bad thing for them. So, so how do we keep... How do we nurture their love and their loyalty for the event? And you know, once I feel safe with that, then yeah, maybe add another 1,000, but only ever very slowly.
And those objectives to preserve kind of the spontaneity and the fun of it at the expense of increased box office. Is that ever at odds with the sustainability of your organization?
No, because the greatest thing about growing it, and the motivation for growing it, is that means more money to do more fun things. So for every punter that comes in, it gets invested back into the event to make it better.
And I hear you raise quite a bit for charity through Secret Garden as well. Can
Yes.
you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so but one of the founding principles was, you know, let's do good with the money we make. So so far we've raised over $200,000, which doesn't seem like that much for an 8-year festival, but you can sort of discount the first 4 years as we sort of broke even, lost a bit of money, and then so yeah. But the thing was to raise money for charities, and so we've got about 3 or 4 charities that we give money to.
And Danielle, you started the, I mean, All About Women is a fantastic program. Absolutely loved it this year. But it originated with the F word, is that right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us about the success of that and maybe what you learned from it and how that informed what All About Women became?
Yeah, so the F word was part of our annual talks program, and it was one day in our second largest venue with 3 sessions lined up, and we had Jermaine Greer, Naomi Wolf, and then a panel talking about feminism. And this was, you know, 6 years ago. So, you know, our spidey senses were all saying, you know, like, this is, people want to talk about this. We need to go back to this. We need to look at, you know, what came before, what's coming now. And, you know, certainly, you know, like, there's something in this. So we created this event and completely sold out. And the buzz was just incredible, not just in the room, but in the foyers. Like, nobody wanted to leave. And that was that moment to sort of go, oh, okay, there's something here. And Louise Heron came in as our first female CEO, and she was like, yeah, we've got to do this. Like, we've got to talk about this. And it's the one festival that I really hope has a time limit on it, because if we're still doing All About Women, you know, and it's still having to talk about and give women voices because they don't get voices in a lot of talks and ideas programs, you know, then that's really sad. That'll be a failure for that festival. If it's still going in 10 years' time, that will be a failure for that. So, you know, that's something that we're really conscious of and really working towards, and also trying to evolve it as we go with who is this for. It's not just for women, it's not, you know, it's for everybody, it's for anybody. And so what does that mean? And we think about it very, very carefully, and it's really, really hard because it's perhaps not the best name in saying All About Women, because it's not about everything, and you can't do that in any one festival. But it came from a certain moment in time. And I think, you know, in terms of talking about evaluating success, really needing to move away from the numbers, and this is also in terms of funding and things like that, we have to start talking about success in a very different way. It can't just be about the big numbers and the big numbers in terms of attendances, numbers of people that performed or spoke or whatever, the amount of money that we made. We have to start talking about it in terms of contribution to society, in terms of contribution to that artist's career at that point, in terms of our own understanding of the world around us. You know, we're sick with this kind of love of talking about numbers, and I, really try and talk about the work now and share that with my colleagues who sometimes are in roles where their jobs is to think about numbers. Like I've got to get on the phone to the finance people and go, tell them that story about what happened backstage, which was so funny, and that the person came off stage and said, "This is the best thing that I've ever done." Like this, and we did that, we made that happen. You helped make that happen. Because if everyone just keeps looking at those numbers, we're not going to grow culturally, I think. We're just going to kind of keep falling in love with bigger and, look at some of these events. Like, who doesn't want to go to that? And, if we just keep going for big. Of course there's a place for big and there's a place for that. Of course there is, but we have to talk about more.
Is the numbers often will take the passion out of the creatives, because I for a while was kind of struggling with, well, shouldn't I just be performing my own writing? Shouldn't I just be putting out a book? But then I would do an event and literally someone would come up to me and say, "You've changed my life. I'm going to go and write poetry, and this is incredible." Or "Oh, I just set up a poetry slam in Wagga because of your thing," or I can perform Bengali at the multilingual poetry slam, and I've never had the opportunity to be heard before. And that made me feel like I was suddenly maybe like a film director or something in an artistic way. Being a creative was creating an experience for people. And if you just have to start looking at all the spreadsheets and the grants and the numbers and all that sort of stuff, then you lose your passion for, I guess, feeling like curatorship is an art form.
Lisa has a really, this is a good take-home tip for people with funding things, about how to talk about numbers that make sense to people who need to hear numbers, but that actually are perhaps more relevant. Do you want to?
Oh, thank you
Sorry.
for that introduction. Hopefully people will find it useful.
I'm going to borrow this
but I'll give you some context for this. So last year, the Melbourne Writers Festival turned 30, and it was my third year as director, and we had an absolutely massive festival. We had 600 artists and just under 600 events across 54 venues right across Melbourne. Which was the biggest festival in every sense that we'd had, including the biggest audience. So there was a lot going on in terms of scale, and we felt there was a fitting celebration for a City of Literature festival and all those kinds of things. But actually, when we started to look back at the festival, although the box office had been great, we had great partnerships, great year for philanthropy, all those kinds of things, we felt that there had been something missing from the festival, and that perhaps the bigger festival wasn't the right choice for us, and what was really missing for me was intimacy, and so that sense that everything was so big, everything was happening all the time. There was a big sense of FOMO, so one of the key things we got back from our audience was they felt there was too much on at any given point in time, which as a curator is kind of like, well, I've given you the option of 10 amazing events with international authors or our best homegrown authors all at the same time, but actually it had gotten to a tipping point with our audience where they felt it was too much to choose from, and so they felt disappointed about missing out on certain things, which was really hard feedback for me to hear, because my kind of thing is like, but you're sad because you're missing out on awesome things. Like, that's what a festival should be, and if you don't have that sense of missing out, then why are you at a festival? But actually I think what I've learned from that is that size isn't always great, and you want people to have that sense that there's a lot going on, but they can still choose a great path for them through the festival and all those kinds of things. So across the last year at Melbourne Writers Festival, what we've really been focusing on, this is what Danielle gave me the intro for, is not overall numbers for things, but capacity at events. So does any particular event meet the capacity that you've set for it? So The smallest event we do at the Melbourne Writers Festival is for 5 people, and it is a lucky dip kind of surprise event, which I always enjoy curating. So it's in a caravan, you buy a ticket, come along, you get in the caravan, you sit around a table with 4 other people, and then the door opens and a writer walks in and you just literally have a 20-minute conversation with them. So that event for us pretty much runs at 100% capacity because it's only 5 tickets, so it sells out really quickly. And then at the other end of the scale, we have our sort of stadium events, which are opening night and things like that, which we do in the town hall, which seats about 1,800 people. And so when we sort of measure the success of an event like that, it's often that, we had 2,000 people along to something, but actually what we're using more now is, was it at capacity? So for me, the minimum capacity that I would want any event to run at is 60%, because this is about 60-70% in here, which feels like a good number. If it's below 50%, it means the event hasn't met its mark, so it means we've had an ambition for an event that the audience hasn't responded to because it's half empty. But if the event's at 95% capacity, even if it's in a small venue or a big venue, it means we've made that right match between author and moderator and where the event's happening and when it's happening. So yeah, capacity of venue is more important for us at the moment than number of people who are actually at the festival or at any given event.
And of course, I think who benefits from access to culture and to transformative stories and experiences is also really important.
Yeah.
I guess you talked both, I think, Danielle and Lisa, about digital audiences as well, digital engagement, and how that allows you to grow what you're doing in your audiences. Does that ever threaten, like, in real life engagement? Is that something that you see as necessarily a positive, or is there a tension there at all?
I don't think it threatens it at all, and anybody that still thinks that, has rocks in their head, honestly. Just because you can see the live stream, live is everything. We are about to enter a golden age, people. We're in the right jobs. Stay with it.
Another golden age.
Another golden age. I think digital. The role for digital is, to share beyond the live space, to cultivate an audience that, certainly at the Opera House, we want people, if they've seen something online and then they come here, they might know actually it's not just opera. That's a great thing. That's a great way. But and it's also an opportunity to share what you've seen with your friends, to keep the conversation, to use that cliche, going. I think that the role for digital to add to your experience either before or after, so that you can engage with more and more content around what you've just seen, is really exciting, and it's adding these layers of programming. And I think that that's excellent, and people are hungry for information, which is what digital can help us achieve.
Yeah.
So it doesn't just stop.
Points, really.
It's just more access.
Creating more access points, and I don't think it disturbs the live experience. And I know from curating spoken word with Sydney Writers Festival, it can often be a process of just looking through a whole series of YouTube clips eventually. And originally, as a performing writer, I thought, why would I put my video up on YouTube? Wouldn't people just look at that and go, okay, well, I've seen the show already. Why do I need to see it as a live experience? But now it's actually just like it can be like a business card or a calling card to the live experience.
Yeah, Australia Council did a big research project for something 5 years ago, so it's probably very out of date now, but about digital audiences, and they found that something like 57% of people look at videos online before deciding to buy a ticket to go to an event, which was very scary for me at the time, working at the Emerging Writers Festival, because we had no money, so we were like, where's this content going to come from? But it's really, because I don't buy my tickets that way, and I think I'm probably a different kind of cultural consumer, but it was really eye-opening in terms of thinking about how people actually come to our events and how we can do those things. I believe in the live as well. Obviously, everyone here believes in the live, so thank you for being here tonight. I think, social media is social, and it's an opportunity for people to come together before, during and after the events, which means they will want to keep coming to those events.
But do you see the live in your context as a access point to the book? Because the book itself is a different experience.
Not necessarily. I think
or to the text, I mean?
Yeah, so I think in the sort of more literary side of what we do at Melbourne Writers Festival, the live experience can be an entree to the book, or it can be something that comes after reading the book. So you've read the book, you loved it, you want to find out more about the author. But on the more ideasy side of things, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the book. And I think Naomi Klein, who's one of the artists we shared last year, is a great example of that, because her book came out, it was so important, climate change, Naomi Klein, massive, the book is like this big, and I know not everyone will pick up that kind of book and read it, and so they do want to have the opportunity to come and hear her, distill her ideas into a 30-minute lecture, and then have that opportunity to hear her speak and answer questions and things like that. So even though it is a writers' festival and we do want to sell books and support our literary industry and all those kinds of things, it's not necessarily an exact direct correlation between one and the other.
I want to talk a little bit about maybe the pitfalls and the perils of success. I think we often plan in the arts for worst case scenarios. We don't always plan for things going absolutely terrifically right. Certainly, I think success breeds opportunity. I think a lot of people come knocking on the door and want to work with you. Has there ever been challenges for you that are born out of this degree of popularity? I'd like to talk maybe on two different scales, maybe starting with you, Miles, on when this idea of doing slams, etc., became more widely known and started to hit kind of more commercial areas. Yep. Were you seduced by kind of opportunities that you might otherwise have rejected?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things that we look at in this funding climate as well is every commercial opportunity that we can conceive of. But we get a lot of emails from advertising agencies wanting to create an ad in the style of poetry slam performances and a spoken word performance. So we've done an ad with Mazda. We recently did one with OPSM. We've done, all kinds of things. But, there's a level of integrity where you just have to go, that is just way too far. So there was one that we loved that was really interesting, which was a relationship with Groupon, where they wanted the Australian Poetry Slam champion to write 3 tweets, 3 Facebook updates, and 3 Instagram messages for Valentine's Day that people could buy for $1 off of Groupon. And the way that it came to us was the poet came to us and said, hey, now that I've won the Australian Poetry Slam, I've been getting these phone calls, and I got an email from somebody asking me to do these things for Groupon, and they're going to give me $100. And I was like, wait a minute, you're doing this as the Australian Poetry Slam champion? Yeah. I was like, well, that's our brand. I should have a chat with whoever you're speaking to. And so they put us in touch with the advertising agency, or the poet did. And I said, well, how many hours is he going to be writing for? What does a copywriter get paid? Well, it's his original content. He's not creating something for a brand. So I kind of pushed the budget further and further. And it was a really successful campaign. They sold like 8,000 of them. And I was thinking, wow, we got to do that again. And then on the flip side, we got an email from somebody saying, hey, we want to put a whole bunch of kids into a short film who are doing their own slam poetry. Like, somebody between the ages of 14 and 18 that you can put us in touch with, and we want to do this short film about them playing basketball, and then they turn to camera and they perform their poetry. It's like, oh, that sounds pretty interesting. Can you tell us a bit more? I started emailing some of the teenage poets and saying, hey, there might be an opportunity for you to be in a film. And then the next email was, and then at the end of the video, I should have mentioned this before, we want them to eat a Whopper. And I was like, for what? Oh, sorry, it's a Hungry Jack's ad. And I was like, right. And then they came back and they were like, hey, just so you know that we're like serious about this, we've got $100 for each of the kids. And I was like, wait a minute, that's wrong on so many levels. There's just no way that we would take the kids down that path and to have our name associated with something that we don't believe in. It's really a kind of tricky cakewalk because, you could have the Coca-Cola Poetry Slam and we rely on the poets to participate in something, and if they perceived it as this commercial venture, then you'd kind of start to shoot yourself in the foot, and I imagine that's the same.
So you'd want more than $100?
Well, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. If they said, well, we've got $50,000, we would have been like, well, we'll leave it up to the kids and their parents, But it wouldn't have been something that we would have been like, hey, wait. I mean, there's Stedford now, which has this similarity to the Australian Poetry Slam, but they're like the McDonald's of Stedford. You know? So, and I kind of, you know, I grumble at that a bit.
Yeah, yeah. Danielle, what are the challenges? I mean, you work in one of the most successful arts organizations in the country. It's an icon. It has, I think all of us here, all of us in Australia have an emotional kind of bond with the Opera House. It's symbolic in many ways, and it has to be many things to many different people. Does that limit what you can do in there? Does it, how easy is it for you to take risks with programming when you're dealing with such a successful icon?
Look, there's so many factors in it. I mean, the programmers are all incredibly conscious of what they've got to work with, which is, you know, when you shine that laser beam onto a certain topic or a certain artist, amazing things can happen. That's an amazing venue, and certainly it's been undergoing a whole process of you know, showing itself to be more than just a heritage, you know, art form building, you know, and Vivid Live is one of those things right now. I mean, sometimes the best successes come accidentally and in ways that you would think should be much easier. So Songlines, which is on the projections on the Opera House at the moment. So our head of Indigenous programming, Rhoda Roberts, you know, worked with our Vivid Live festival director, Ben Marshall, and, you know, they're internal programming colleagues, and I couldn't imagine anything more beautiful or more special to happen. But, you know, like, it's funny that it happened now. Like, you know, they've been working side by side for a while. So sometimes it's sort of like you're surprised by the people that you have around you to better collaborate. And I think the other thing with the Opera House is, you know, we have great collaborations across many areas, but I think one of the things about collaboration that's not often spoken about is collaboration doesn't have to be equal. And I think a lot of people kind of forget that you both don't have to get the same things out of that collaboration. You know, so with, you know, to use Lisa, and because we moved the Festival of Dangerous Ideas dates to better align with the Melbourne Writers Festival so that we could make better use of pooling our budgets to invite some heavy hitters and things like that. But some years it works better in Lisa's favour, and some years it works better in our favour. It's not, we don't sit there and kind of, you know, prescribe like who's getting what, and if we did, it wouldn't be a good collaboration. And that goes for all scales of work, you know. You know, I think that's one of the things that I think a lot of people don't think about, especially if you're a smaller or an independent artist that's, you know, working with the Opera House or whatever. If you are looking for that exact same thing both ways, then you're going to be really disappointed. And certainly an organisation like the Opera House and my colleagues, they're amazing people there. And if we're just seen as the cash cows, it's not going to be a very nice relationship. And you're not going to get the best out of that building, which is way more than being a building that obviously has multi areas that it can pull funds from, you know. So yeah, that's my hot tip if you ever come and work with us.
Key strategies is to partner with larger organisations like Sydney Writers Festival, Sydney Opera House, Sydney Theatre, because, you know, they've got larger mailing lists as well. Yeah. You know, so yeah, that's been really good for us because, you know, we suddenly are on stage at Sydney Theatre, and at Sydney Theatre we were basically performing in front of the set of whatever they had on a Sunday, and they weren't doing programming on Sundays because they were paying their staff and actors double time on Sundays. That was when we made the transition from the State Library. We kind of shopped around to see where we could put the National Poetry Slam, and the State Sydney Theatre said, yeah, sure, we can give you any Sunday you want. And we were like, wow, that's amazing, and we won't charge you for the venue, we'll just cover our costs. And so we did this thing, and we got funding, and we it's basically sold out Sydney Theatre, so we were really excited about it, and we only charged like $25 or whatever. But then, when we actually got the bill, we were like, oh, wait a minute, you've charged us double time for everybody, so you've charged us $12,000 for the venue, and then we've got this money left over, which is like $3,000 or something, or $6,000. So we were like, okay, well, let's move everything to Thursday. And still, we just perform in front of whatever set there is, or you just close the curtain. But it was, for us, it was a great learning curve, but also a great opportunity, because they've got a show that's booked in there, that's paid for the venue, that they can have Kate Blanchett in, or whoever was starring in whatever show. But then we could just kind of go, all right, well, we'll just stand in front of the curtain, because it's just a poet with a microphone. And so they were, on a Thursday, giving us a really amazing deal on this space, but it gave us like international entree to the festivals that we work with in China and Indonesia, particularly the Opera House. Like if you go to China and say, hey, and the winner gets to perform at Sydney Opera House, and then they go, oh wow, we've heard of that venue. But if you said if you said QPAC, they'd be like, huh, what? What's the QPAC? So yeah, I mean, there's that.
And I do think the bigger organisations like Melbourne Writers Festival, Sydney Opera House have a sort of social responsibility to support those kinds of things as well. For you to get a $12,000 bill and not know it was coming, it's a bit concerning.
Yeah.
But particularly with festivals, and Melbourne Writers Festival, I assume it's the same with Sydney and most of the other capital city writers festivals. There's a real sense with us that we're able to provide a platform for a variety of different organisations to grow their audience, to put them in front of some, you know, interested people in interesting spaces and all those kinds of things. And we get a lot out of that because we get, you know, diversity, access to their audience, lots of different kinds of programming, help with curating, all those kinds of things. But then the flip side for us is we do have bigger budgets, and so we try to make sure it's fair for everyone who's taking part.
Yeah. Great. I think, I wonder whether we might not open it up to audience questions now. Lex, Lex has got a microphone there, and we do need to put your voice through the microphone since we're recording. So if you've got any questions for our panelists, feel free to put your hand up. Yep, over there.
Hi, and thanks to everyone who's spoken. My question is that it seems with organisations like the Melbourne Writers Festival and the Opera House, and even before the Opera House with Mardi Gras, you have either a set community or a set of communities that you can tap into that already exists. With The Secret Garden and previously with poetry, there wasn't communities that were there that were existing. Did you have to build the communities yourself, or did you find some other kinds of communities to tap into? And if so, what worked and what didn't work around that?
So it happened kind of accidentally with Secret Garden in that I spoke earlier about how we have a bunch of artists and architects and stuff working on Secret Garden, plus it's run on my family farm, and I have 2 brothers, and they all had friends who were going to music festivals, and so 300 people, it wasn't that hard to get that audience. But then from there, it was just really focusing on making the perfect weekend imaginable, because then the product was just going to sell itself, and the word of mouth would just kind of happen, and that's how it grew to 5,000. So it was only 2 years ago that we said yes to our first article in a newspaper, on a digital social guide, and then it was only 2 years ago that we paid for our first piece of advertising on Facebook. So until then, we hadn't done any kind of paid advertising or any media, and yeah, the reason for that was the word of mouth, and building our community based on creating a really, really good event. Because if the product's good, the rest will follow, I believe.
And I think with the Poetry Slam, the aim is to actually give voice to communities, because an example is in New South Wales, we tour to 7 regional areas, and in those regions, the local population, poets from that, or writers or storytellers from that community suddenly get an opportunity to be heard by their neighbors. So they'll go down to their local library in Kempsey, and there'll be 100 people there, and those people in that room choose their 2 Kempsey Poetry Slam champions, who then go and represent them at the State Library or at Sydney Opera House, and so it actually becomes a community building exercise, because then through several years of working in Wagga or Gosford, now there's a poet who's come through that process several times who sets up the Wagga Poetry Slam, and they have a monthly Poetry Slam, and then in Gosford the same thing. And then you can look at also some of the people who've come through all the way to the national level. They've gone back and set up the Red Dirt Poetry Festival in the Northern Territory, or they've gone to set up Spoken Word South Australia, which is like a burgeoning arts organization now in South Australia, but it was born from 2 people who just kept winning their state Poetry Slam, and they were like, well, we don't want to go every year. That's not fair. Why don't we just try and help and facilitate other people? And I think, I don't know, I mean, I wasn't expecting that we were going to develop a community, but I think that people who want to perform their writing are there, and if you give them an opportunity to be heard, they'll congregate. And then if you empower the audience to kind of make some decisions about that event, like something as simple as you can judge, then yeah, it just becomes this participatory experience, and hopefully it just continues to grow, and I can look at my succession plan from Word Travels and go, okay, well now I'm going to go and write my book, write my novel.
Anyone else?
If I could focus on the question of success, one of the problems with festivals is they can be a bit like the circus coming to town. The circus comes to town, everyone gets terribly excited and enjoys the circus, and the circus moves on, and there's not much left apart from the memories. In terms of festivals, your festivals, surely 2 ways of looking at success would be what kind of legacy a festival might leave. I mean, in terms of what might happen as a result of the festival when the festival isn't on. And I think Miles sort of gave one example when you talked about the notion of things happening in other centres, which sort of feed into the Poetry Slam. So the first thing is, what kinds of things might happen after the Festival of Dangerous Ideas is over, or after the Melbourne Writers' Festival is over? And secondly, in terms of measuring success, do you ever consider how many people the festival might touch while it's on, apart from those who actually go, through things like radio interviews, podcasts, the impact it has on the conversation of the city generally?
Yes, we do. I mean, that's a big part of reporting and assessing the impact that you've had. We certainly can look at that through the publicity and all of that kind of work. And that's, I guess, what festivals do with the circus coming to town. You have teams of people that are focused on setting that up, and certainly with the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, in particular all about women, the content that it feeds across the news networks are huge. And it's the same thing with the Writers' Festivals. There's not a publication that isn't carrying something, and that's not necessarily for us about marketing it. It is, being in the situation that the festival is already at a fairly good state. We don't really want to grow it much more. It's doing really well. It's good to know your limits. It's good to know that, which is, we can afford to be a lot more generous and make sure that media and they're doing like the speakers are doing other events in universities, smaller things, more intimate things, all about women. Really lucky that we were able to bring an artist out, and he could then do in-home performances, for 15, people. They went to their homes. So that's because we're at a level where, because we've got the success that we want, we can kind of be a lot more generous, and certainly we use all of those measures when we talk about it. But there is a huge barrier in talking about culture, and the, you know, there's many kind of models for this that everyone's exploring. But I think we were talking about, you know, as programmers and people in cultural leadership positions, to talk not just about the numbers. Like, that's my, you know, big thing, to talk about the effect that it's had, those personal experiences that it's had, how it's changed that. And we were joking before, but although it's quite true, is also, you know, like being able to measure things in 10 years' time. Like, how do you kind of, I mean, I'm sure most people get all of their dinner party conversations after coming to Festival Ideas for the next year.
How do you measure that?
How do I measure that?
Does the Opera House have a community cultural development program as well? Are they in that space also?
Well, yes, because it's, I mean, that's one of the big mandates, to be, you know, a meeting place. And unfortunately, I think that's one of the things about large organisations, and we have a responsibility for doing that, but you can't do it all the time, you can't do it for everyone. And so that's really very, very hard, and we're constantly conscious about what you're saying yes to, what you're saying no to, and what you can help and who you can help and who you can't help. And it's a lot of weight.
I know. I know. I mean, our process has been like community cultural development, but now there's actually artistic excellence in our program, because prior to us doing this, there weren't like poetry slam champions who you could say have toured to writers' festivals around the Asia Pacific or wherever, or had these accomplishments, you know, like Omar Musa on Q&A, and then publishes a great book. And now we can start to look at, well, how do we just create like a 4-person amazing show with these spoken word artists? But our origins are, you know, this whole community cultural development process, which is, you know, to create opportunities for people to make it to the Opera House stage. I mean, that's, I suppose, a potential area that the Opera House, is there like something that you guys are looking at that kind of brings people to
the artistic
excellence
there
level?
is, and there's certainly, I mean, one of the programs that's been really successful is this thing called Stunt Lounge, which we did with the Fruit Flyer Circus. So the Fruit Flyer Circus, once they reach a certain age, it's, you know, it's a kids circus, so where do they go next? What happens next? And so been working with some of those soon-to-be graduates to create a show, which then, you know, was shown at the Opera House, and they worked with us as well in a development sense of learning how to tour, like how to do great budgets, how to market, how to write copy, how to, you know, we gave them complete access. And I think there's more of those sorts of models that we will be looking at, but certainly also partnering with people who do that kind of work as well, to be the platform. As I say, sometimes we can just be the venue, and sometimes we need to be more than that.
I think with curators, we definitely want to measure impact. So what's happening in a year, 10 years' time that have come out of what we do. Certainly, if my KPIs were all number driven, I would be very bored, because in a way that's kind of easy to do, and you can get a big name person and fill those seats, and that's the end of it. One of my favourite things come out of last year's festival was we had an Indigenous author, Tony Birch, interview Will Self for our closing night address, which was a marvellous event. But then Tony and Will kept in touch, and they had lunch in London, and they're working on a collaboration together, which just makes me feel so happy that we were able to create that space at the festival for that to happen. Unfortunately for curators, is how do you get everyone who's involved with the festival in the audience, who might have discovered a new book, one of the artists who sets out on a new collaboration, how do you gather all that information and try to understand it, collate it, you know, turn it into something that you can give funders and your board and your audiences and things like that. Like, it's not neat in the way the audience numbers or box office is neat. And I think that's kind of, as Danielle's mentioned, a sort of new frontier for curators and programmers to how do we actually take this information and turn it into something that is, you know, a tellable story about our events. I
mean, even sat here today, I think a lot of you work in arts organizations. Like, how many of us decided to make it a career because we saw this life-transforming show or film or artist? And, you know, if we were able to share that story back to these organizations, I'm sure that'd be really useful.
Just a question.
So do share back to organisations that you've enjoyed events at.
There's the Twitter handles.
Yes.
I was going to ask Lisa, how do you kind of humbly or gracefully take acknowledgement or credit from something that you see began at the festival, and then, you know, 5 years later you can see the development of this idea? I mean, if they're not saying, "Hey, isn't it amazing? We met at the Writers' Festival," you know, I mean, how do you kind of trace that back without sounding like you're just taking, credit for it. Cause
I don't know is the answer to that. And so when I was at the Emerging Writers Festival...
You don't be humble.
Don't be humble, just take it. So at the Emerging Writers Festival, which is a professional development festival for writers, we, through a lot of the language we use with our writers, really encourage them to feed back in their stories. And so the Emerging Writers Festival has done it really well in terms of, getting the artists to acknowledge that it's played a really significant role, and that's just about having those conversations over time. I know there's other things that have come out of festivals I've done that I probably wouldn't take that credit for because it feels a bit crass, in a setting, and if they're not individually letting you know that they see your platform as a marker of their success, then that's a hard question. Or just take credit. Just, why not?
Yeah.
And I reckon keeping in touch with artists over time
really
as well is important.
Yeah, so
those
can,
relationships.
Open the door for them to make those comments and feedback.
That's what we were saying. I was saying before that it's been only very recent that I've worked out how to measure personal success, and it comes really only this year did I kind of work this out. When I, in my other life and ambitions, I'm a theatre director, and when I do that work, I don't really care about. I honestly don't care about GBO or anything like that. If my mum and dad come, that's a bit of a success. When I make that kind of work, I realise that my measure there is if those people will work with me again, and I've only just come to realise that the same thing applies now in my programming and creative producing life, which is not just speakers, artists that want to come back and that you continue a conversation. That's definitely a measure. Not just agents that you've got a good rapport, but also my colleagues, people who come back for special projects when you ask them to. That is personally a measure of success now. Because it makes me, thanks guys, it makes you realise that, you must be doing something right for, in your bad moments and good moments. That's how I honestly only kind of worked that out this year when I was thinking about the differences in those two jobs, because it's been, maybe it's going home at 5 o'clock. Is that success? Is that what success is? I don't know. And then I realised, no, it's about the artists wanting to work with you again and your colleagues wanting to work with you again. And it's the same thing when I'm making a show or making a program or making a festival. It's the same measure.
That's really important for arts managers. So a few years ago at the festival, we didn't have a very good year in terms of box office, and a lot of the staff, including me, felt a little bit demoralised at the end of that. And that's when I suddenly had these thoughts of, well, if you're tying everything that you put into something to numbers, figures, there's so many things that can derail those kinds of things. Or if you massively exceed them, you might be elated, but you can exceed them without actually having a deep impact in what you're doing. So one of the things I brought into the Melbourne Writers Festival is that we try to tie in personal KPIs every year to each of the staff. So if the festival has a great year or a bad year, they're still able to track how they personally feel about it. And for me as well, 8 years in the arts, and that was just like a light bulb moment of I can track how I feel about something separate from numbers, which is, incredible.
There's a question at the back there.
Thanks. I just wanted to return to the perils and pitfalls part of the question. And everyone danced quite nicely around that for very understandable reasons. I guess where I'm coming from is there are certain kinds of success, particularly for smaller organisations or organisations on particular kinds of growth paths, where success can kill you. The organisation, not the people, but that does happen too.
Same thing.
Yeah, quite seriously. And I'm thinking of in Sydney, just two examples are things like the Imperial Panda Festival, where it became too successful, it became too visible, and therefore it could all the rules that it was delicately ignoring suddenly couldn't anymore, because it suddenly became visible to authority. The guys who run the Camelot Lounge now in the music space, they used to have an illegal space, and it became too well known. So success almost destroyed them, and so they had to then join a different kind of system in order to continue to operate. But that doesn't work for everybody. When you transition from doing one thing really, really well, and then you do it so well that you become really popular or really well known as a consequence of that, and then you take the next step and you get bigger, and that doesn't always work. And sometimes that can actually destroy the things that made you work in the first place. So have any of the panel had an experience like that in a current or former organisation? I recognise that it's going to take a lot to destroy something like the Melbourne Writers' Festival or the Sydney Opera House. That probably won't happen. But
Touch wood.
Is there an
Sounds like a challenge.
Yeah, is there an experience of that nature that when identifying success and you were trying to solve the wrong thing, or you chose the wrong lesson? That's a very long question.
Yeah, I think with a lot of organisations, the feeling is that bigger is better, and that's not necessarily true. I think if you're getting bigger for a reason, because there's audience interest and media interest and people are coming along, but you feel that whatever you're doing can't sustain that size, you need to go back to your core strategy of what you're trying to achieve. So my 3 years at the Emerging Writers Festival was a really boom time for the festival. Our audience has doubled, our box office doubled, our philanthropic and grant support more than doubled. So it was absolutely extraordinary to be a part of that. And again, it was about a community of people coming together and really having access to the kinds of programming that we were doing, which is quite unique at the time. And what happened at the end of that 3 years is we kind of looked at it and said, what are we trying to achieve here? We don't necessarily want the Emerging Writers Festival to get bigger, but what can we be doing? So we made some decisions about rolling out as a national organisation, so doing what we were doing but in other places. We put up the amount of money that we paid our artists. We made sure our staff were getting paid, basically a living wage, which I hadn't and no one else had been receiving beforehand. So it was then about not just getting bigger for the sake of it, but thinking, where can we put this money and where can we put this interest where it'll have the most impact for the people that we're trying to support, which was the emerging artists.
Do you want to mention the festivalists?
Yeah.
And because that's...
Yeah, maybe. I mean,
that...
I think, so this organisation that I spoke about, which I founded 11 years ago, I closed 2 weeks ago. And the reason I closed it is not that it wasn't doing well, it was actually doing really well, but that in a way, what we'd set out to do, we did. And not everyone starts an organisation to become the next Google or Sydney Opera House. And in fact, what drove us to create this organisation was what we perceived as an absence in the cultural landscape in Sydney that progressively got filled by us in a very small way and by other people who also felt it and pitched in and were inspired. So certainly I think it's true, sometimes you can put an end to something and that's not a failure. That's actually something that's quite, where the time is right to do that. And maybe it inspires others to work under that radar and keep doing some of the things you were doing elsewhere. I know, Claire, maybe you can speak to that as well, because Definitely. For a long time, Secret Garden was under the radar and could get away with doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And whether that visibility that comes with now having 5,000 people creates its own set of problems as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, we flew under the radar. We could do whatever we wanted, and it was fantastic, and we were running a really great event that had no real problems. But as we got bigger, we became more visible, and then local regulation came in. And for an event, I was 22 when I started Secret Garden and never put on an event before. So to suddenly have all these systems that would be quite familiar to big organisations and a blueprint, I nervously spent the next few years trying to understand and meet, police's expectations and and council expectation. It was it nearly, you know, ended the festival. You know, like it was so full on and so out of my depth, and you know, because we are small and I couldn't afford, you know, the best operations manager to just bosh out a risk assessment that council needed, you know, really, and that's what would happen to a lot of small organisations trying to put on events. And a lot of the reason why a lot of festivals have gone under is because they just could not meet that level of expectation from council and police and fireys and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I definitely feel the weight of bureaucracy with our organisation. So, you know, initially, as I said, we had a volunteer, and then a friend of mine who was a lawyer who said, "I'll be your chair. You be the vice chair, your volunteer will be your secretary and your treasurer. The three of us will form an incorporated association, we'll apply for a grant." But now we've got a general manager, a partnership manager, we've got teams of volunteers who are a mixture of work experience, interns, and just genuine want to be there volunteers. And so it's like 11 people in a 3-room office space in the Rocks. But then there's like deductible gift recipient status and tax concession charity, and then, oh, we're an incorporated association, and the Australia Council says, well, we won't give you funding to do national programming because you need to be a corporation limited by guarantee, and then you need to be registered with the Australian National Charities, Not-for-Profit Charities Commission. And so further and further away I get from just like writing poetry and finding other people who love to write poetry and giving them opportunities to perform their poetry. It's just, you know, that level of success just gets, you know, closer and closer to filling out your BAS statements and your PAYG and, you know, your reporting. And fortunately, we're starting to get enough people in who can take on some of those roles, but I'm still kind of standing there going, right, so I'm like an HR manager, I'm like a marketing person, I'm like a finance director, but I don't have any of those qualifications or any of those skills. So like I'm turning to our 8 board members now for those sorts of things. And yeah, I get nervous and worried about my own creativity and where that's going to go if I'm just focused on the day-to-day bureaucracy. And one of the things that I count as a failure is I was saying to my wife recently, because we had 6 months without a general manager, I was saying, well, maybe I can just run the organization. I'm just doing it. I'll just be executive director and creative director. There's lots of organizations do that. And she said, well, yeah, you're doing a great job with the company, but you haven't really spent much time with your family, and you really think about the fact that, well, you don't really contact any of your friends, so you have no social life. So if you want to do that, you know, if you just want to run the company and that's your goal, that's cool, but I don't know if this is going to work as a family, and I don't know if I'm going to stick around for it, and, you know, your friends, you should call them. And I was like, oh, yeah, true, okay. Okay, yeah, we'll continue with the recruitment process.
I know that, I think that that's kind of the story of Mardi Gras as well, which is when it came into the light, a lot of things changed. You know, it's not what it was, and I do think this year it found its feet again in a really spectacular way, and in terms of its relevancy again. But I know that when I was there, I had a big focus on kind of finding new streams of income, because budgets were pretty hard, and when we had one success one year, we thought we could replicate it the next year, and then when it didn't quite come off, you know, that's one of the scariest things as well, that you think that you can replicate this thing, you know, each year, and you put it into the budget and suddenly it's not there. And even though that's a decent sized organisation, those budgets are small. It is community. It's just big, and it has a built-in some built-in audience there. But you know, I definitely that was kind of scary, and because I'd also grown quite quickly in what I was looking after, and I didn't have the skills to understand what I needed to do for this touring model that I'd suddenly introduced. And I was very, very lucky that people who were you know, like really well-known promoters and things took me on board and taught me and they just that mentorship that I got was really important in not taking the whole thing. Though like it probably. It did have a bit of cover, obviously, but you get quite used to putting it in your budget. And I think if it's not, if you have one success one year, don't bank on it for the next year, because it could be the thing that could... Grants models,
a grants model is usually, we'll fund it as a new project, and so the next year it's not a new project, so we're not going to fund it. So one year you've got $60,000, the next year you're like, how are we going to do that again without $60,000? And you're trying to match it with that, with $11,000. Or with City of Sydney, they'll fund something for 3 years, which builds you to a momentum, and then you're like, okay, now we're on our own. How do we continue to do that?
And ask for help from people who've done it beforehand. Most people are delighted to be asked to sit down for a coffee where you furiously write notes about the things that they've learnt, probably through their own dumb luck of having to do DAs or budgets or whatever. And then also, if coming into the light is ruining your event, then stop. Do it over here.
Do something else.
Do it over here. Because I mean, those same people are doing the, some of that stuff still lives. It's just as soon as it gets, you just go.
I think what we're hearing quite loud and clear from the four of you as well is that success matters if it's defined according to the terms that matter to you as a programmer and as a representative of the artists that you defend, whose work you defend. And I think one of the challenges is going to be how do we communicate that to bureaucracy and to funders and to sponsors, what really matters in terms of the success we're striving for, and how do we measure that. I think it's been a really fascinating discussion, and I want to thank Sydney Living Museums and the Museum of Sydney for hosting us, and Jimmy at the back for the tech, Lex for assembling such a stellar panel, and all of you for coming tonight, and please join SAMAG if you're not yet a member. And of course, I want to thank you guys for being so candid and so generous with your time and with your insights. We wish you the best of successes on your own terms.
And you too.
Yes. But please join me in thanking our panelists for tonight. Thank you.
And thank you so much to our host, Matt. Wasn't that a fantastic discussion? I just have a couple of more quick thanks. The first one is to Vivid Ideas for including us in their program. There's so many exciting talks and music and all sorts of things happening over the next few weeks. So thank you so much for making us part of that. Also, we have a survey that we would love you to fill out to give us some feedback on where we're succeeding and where we're maybe not. There is actually going to be a link on Twitter. You could fill it out on your bus ride home if you'd like, but otherwise it'll be emailed around to you. We have some drinks put on around the corner at Bar Luca, which is 52 Phillip Street, literally around there. So if you want to go and have a talk and maybe grab somebody and ask about some of the ideas, there might be people in the audience you want to talk to as well. And finally, our next panel is going to be on arts policy in turbulent times, and that'll be on the 27th of June on Monday as well. Obviously very important at this very moment. So. At the Opera House. It's going to be the Opera House. So thank you so much to everyone for coming tonight.